A professor and teaching pastor in Israel for over 3 decades, Bill Schlegel is a specialist in biblical history, biblical geography, and Hebrew studies. He holds a master's in Hebrew language from Jerusalem University College and a bachelor's in education and Bible from Christian Heritage College. He is the co-founder and former professor at the Masters University's Israel Extension and also formerly served on the faculty at Jerusalem University College. He is the author of the Satellite Bible Atlas, as well as The Land and the Bible, a historical geographical companion to the Atlas. Schlegel is also the host of the One God Report podcast and website dedicated to the exploration and promotion of Unitarian Christian theology and biblical studies. He and his wife currently live in Tennessee with the youngest of their 5 children. Please join me in welcoming Bill Schlegel.
Thanks, Keegan. Appreciate organizers of the UCA Conference. Isn't it great to be able to meet like-minded believers? I remember the first time that I came to a conference like this. It wasn't so long ago, about 4 years ago. And it is very important to meet people that believe, that have come to an understanding of who God and the Messiah are, like we have it. So there's probably a number of first-time people here, and it's a neat experience. So we can continue to pray that these conferences continue. I'll pray. Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, we're grateful to be able to call you Father, and for the encouragement we can have in a conference like this, to be challenged, to be chastised maybe, to be directed, to be encouraged. We're so grateful. We thank you in the name of your Son, the man Christ Jesus. Amen. Yes, my title here is Do Micah 5:2 and Matthew 2:5-6 declare the eternal deity of Messiah. In some ways, I would think a passage like this is a bit of a test case, because I know as a Trinitarian believer, I came from a Trinitarian background, there were certain passages in the Old Testament that I consider to at least be a hint, maybe, or maybe something stronger than that there was an expectation, or maybe the prophets didn't really understand it entirely when they were saying it, but now we know that Jesus is somehow God from other places, so, oh yeah, look back there, oh, there it was, that he was God back there. And I see this passage pop up a lot. I'm sort of still in the atmosphere of responding to my former self in a lot of ways, different biblical verses, why that verse is not understood as declaring the deity of Christ, or why this one doesn't either, or what's a better way to understand it, and so forth. So I thought to take a verse like Matthew 5:2 and see, what does it really mean? You can see let's read it here for just a second. But you, O Bethlehem, Ephratah, being little among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Let me read it in Hebrew. Kind of fun just to hear it. Okay, this is the way Hebrew sounds with an American accent. Okay? Ve'ata Bethlehem Ephratah, tza'ir liot ba'alfei Yehuda, mimcha li yetze liot moshel b'Yisrael, u'motza'otav mikedem mimei olam. That little different ring to it than the English language. So this is a passage often remembered at Christmas time. A portion of Micah 5:2, it's quoted partly in Matthew 2:5-6 to describe that Israel's ruler would be born in Bethlehem. Some Christian expositors and laypersons see, I'll put it in big quotes, the eternal pre-incarnate existence of Messiah, and therefore Messiah's deity, in the words of Micah 5:2. In Hebrew, it's actually 5:1. In these words, especially the last part of this phrase, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. Now, that particular translation maybe doesn't really suggest an eternal pre-incarnate deity. Wow, that's quite a statement. Find that one in the scriptures, right? The eternal pre-incarnate deity of the Messiah. It sounds kind of foreign to the Bible. However, even a comparison of English translations shows that eternality, right, the eternal aspect of supposedly the Messiah is supposed to be eternal, the eternality, it's not so cut and dry. I think the King James is actually wrong in this case. King James translators they knew Hebrew and I would assume Greek amazingly well. They knew it amazingly well. But there are some places where you say, oh, you know what, I think that one's not quite so right. The last phrase says in the King James, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Okay, so, and then let's compare the ESV, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Whose goings forth, the King James Version, ESV has whose origin, so there's a difference there in the translation, have been from of old, that's the same. That word's not going to be suggesting eternality as much, perhaps, as the first goings forth. And then this last phrase is the main one that people will focus on to say, oh, see, here's the eternality of Jesus. See, the King James Version, from everlasting, versus the ESV, from ancient days. So if you're reading the ESV, I don't think you would get the idea of the eternality of the Messiah, right? His origin is from of old. Okay, how long ago? From ancient days doesn't really suggest like from forever and ever. So you can see that it's not so cut and dried, this eternality idea, even just in the English translations. My investigation, or our investigation today, has two parts. First, we're going to examine these words, the ones in Micah 5:2, which are under question. And then secondly, we'll look at the context of Micah chapter 5, verse 2. We'll look at a literary context and a historical context. And I think an examination of both these words and the context will show that neither Micah nor Matthew, who quotes it, were declaring the eternal deity of the Messiah. Rather, the passages refer to the promise of God given to David in Israel's historical past. Okay? These words are going to relate to Israel's historical past, not a nebulous eternity. The centuries before Micah, this prophet lived. Okay, so what are the Hebrew words? The first one is this word that's translated sometimes as origin, origins, or goings forth. Motsa'otav, right? You can see the translations. I'm going to leave that one for the end. We're going to take numbers 2 and 3 first. Mikedem, which is the one that's not as problematic, from before, from of old, from long ago. Okay, those, you can't really argue for eternality with those words. But the first one and the third one are the ones that a Trinitarian will say, see, that's eternal. Okay, the third one is mime olam in Hebrew. It's actually a phrase. It's not just one word. Literally, it would be from the days of eternity or from days long ago. That's going to be the question. All right? There's our possible translations. So let's look at these words. And pretty much what I'm going to be able to show, I think, is these phrases do not mean eternity. They're referring to Israel's historical past, something that was going on in Israel's days in previous times. Micah was living around 700 BC, 750 BC, right in the middle of the 700s BC. He's thinking about something that happened hundreds of years before his time, but not in eternity past. Let's begin our word study by noting that the principal words of both numbers 2 and number 3 up here, both of these words, mikedem, see number 2 there, which is from of old, and mime olam, from ancient days, from long ago. Both of these words, the phrases, occur in the book of Micah. So that will be very helpful for us to know what Micah meant when he's using those words in another place in the same book. And the first one is in Micah 7:14. We read, "Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, who dwell alone in a forest in the midst of a garden land. Let them graze in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old. Okay, you see that phrase there? That's the exact same phrase which the King James translation translated as eternity. Okay? So now we have the Israelites grazing their flocks in Gilead and Bashan in eternity past. Okay? Doesn't make sense. And even the King James doesn't translate it as eternity past in this verse. They did in Micah 5:2, but not in Micah 7:14. Okay, so we can see that there's a reference to some time in Israel's past when they grazed flocks in Gilead and Bashan. Perhaps when Israel came out of Egypt. Manasseh and Gad, they settled in Gilead and Bashan because they had sheep, they were shepherds. Or maybe in the time of David or Solomon, the united monarchy, when Israel controlled the Transjordan, they were able to graze their flocks in Bashan and Gilead, where they're in Transjordan. Okay? Now, we can see that the second phrase is as well used in the book of Micah, chapter 7, verse 20. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from days of old. Okay, this phrase in Hebrew, it's kedem. So we can see that this is a time period during Israel's history, as you swore to our fathers, right, in these days of old. So it's not a reference to something in eternity past. More examples. We're doing a word study where we want to look at these same phrases. Do they mean eternity? Do they mean something in a nebulous, distant eternity, or do they refer to Israel's historical past? Psalm 44, verse 1. In Hebrew, sometimes the verse order is just one verse off. It's 44:2 in Hebrew. O God, we've heard with our ears, our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. Okay, the days of Kedem, long ago. Refers to Israel's historical past. Our fathers have told us what you did in these days. Psalm 77. A couple of different occurrences in Psalm 77, verse 6, verse 12. I'll read this. I consider the days of old, same kinds of phrases. They're a little bit different, but the same language. Yamim mikedem. The same basic roots are there. The years long ago. This is the word olamim, that eternity word. Okay? I will remember the deeds of Yahweh. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. That's the exact same, one of the exact same phrases, phrase number 2 that we saw in Micah. You, with your arm, redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Right? See the idea? We see the exact same phrases being used to describe events in Israel's historical past. In this case, bring the Israelites out of Egypt. In all their affliction, he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity, he redeemed them. He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old. Okay, that's our phrase, Yamei Olam. Same phrase that the King James Version translated Micah 5:2 as eternity. Okay, so we can see that, if that's the phrase, why translate it only as eternity in Micah 5:2 and not as eternity here when we're talking about grazing Israel's flocks or God bringing Israel out of Egypt, etc. Then he remembered the days of old, same phrase as eternity in Micah 5:2, of Moses and his people. Where is he who brought them up out of the sea with the shepherds of his flock? It's referring to the time of the Exodus from Egypt, this phrase, which is translated eternity in Micah 5:2. Amos 9:11. In that day, I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen and repair its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. Same phrase, again, as the one that's eternity in Micah 5:2. So will we see a pattern here? This is the prophet Amos in the middle of the 700s BC, and he's looking back and he's recalling the time of David as the days of eternity, the days of old. Okay, it's the same phrase. It's not eternity, obviously. And maybe one or two more. Then the offspring of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord as in the days of old. Same phrase as the eternity one in Micah 5:2. And the former years. Nehemiah 12:46, last one. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph. Okay, these are these same words we're looking at right now. There were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So I think it's clear from these other occurrences in the Bible, the same words that Micah 5:2 uses, long ago, and the days of old, or the days of eternity, if you want to take it that way. It's not a good translation to say the days of eternity. These same phrases do not mean eternity past, but refer to events and acts of God in Israel's historical past, as in days long ago, a time period previous to the prophet's time. One of the big reasons that this verse has been misinterpreted is because of this word olam, which is part of the last phrase. In Hebrew, it's literally the days of eternity, or the days of long ago, is because one meaning for this word olam in Hebrew can have the idea of perpetualness or even eternity. But look at the possibilities for translation. A long time, right? It's an age. It doesn't have to be eternity. It could be the age of Noah, okay? That time period. Okay? It can be a long duration, perpetual, future time, former times, a long time back, of old, everlasting, eternity, eternal. You see how a translation can affect your understanding of a verse. So if I'm a Trinity or Deity of Christ translator, I'll say, oh, one of my options is here. I'll take eternity, or I'll take eternal. His origin is from long ago, from eternity, right? But it wouldn't be a good option for several reasons. One, because what we've just did, we've looked and see how it's used in other places, but especially because the phrase is limited by another word, days, in front of it. Okay? When I originally put this out as a presentation one time, a friend of mine, former friend, wrote me and said, no, but olam is eternity, eternity, eternity. And he looked up a few verses, and you can see, yeah, it does, what could be translated as eternity in the verses he presented. But what was he missing? He was missing this is actually a Hebrew word phrase, the days of, not eternity. Okay? When you have that word days in front of it, this is literally the days of long ago. It eliminates eternity from the possibility when you have days of in front of this word. So as an idiom, combined with the word days, okay, it's not just the word olam, not just the word that could be eternity in some cases. It's not just that word, it's the days of. So combined with this word days of, it means days of long ago, days of a previous historical era. Sometimes we see it with the word years as well, years of long ago. When you combine olam with days or years, now you're talking human historical time. Okay? So the word days and years in construct, right, together with this word olam, restrict the meaning to historical human time. That is to past times, days and years when God did wonders among the fathers, the times of the patriarchs, or the exodus from Egypt and the conquest are especially thought of as days or years of long ago, when Yahweh led his people like a shepherd by the hand of Moses, Aaron, and Joshua. David's days are also specifically recalled. We looked at the one reference in Amos chapter 9, verse 11, where he said, I'll restore the booth of David as in the days of old, as in the days of eternity, Doesn't make sense. The days of past time, the way it used to be. Now, Amos was living around in the early, called 8th century, 770 BC. And he was recalling David's time, 250 years before, as the days long ago. This is the same thing Micah is doing. So, when or what are Micah's days of long ago? I would suggest that Micah has in mind not a nebulous eternity past, but God's ancient promise to David. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, 1 Chronicles 17, Psalm chapter 2. Dustin just did a good podcast in the Biblical Unitarian podcast where he's looking at the promise, the Davidic covenant, the Davidic promise. If you haven't heard it, I highly recommend it. And this is what the prophet Micah is thinking about, that God made a promise 250 years ago to David. Yeah, this is what he's thinking about. From before, from days long ago, Yahweh, the God of Israel, made a promise to David that one of David's descendants would rule over Israel. By the way, notice that. He will be a ruler for me over Israel, not just Judah. So there's a hope in Micah of a king who rules over the unified south Judah and northern kingdom called Israel. So this prophecy is also a hope of a unification of the kingdom of Israel. Not just Judah separate, because in Micah's time, Judah is separate, and Israel is about to be destroyed as a kingdom. The north is. So here, Micah is looking forward to a unified kingdom again. But in Micah's days, things looked grim, because the greatest superpower the world had yet seen, Assyria, was demolishing Israel in the north and was making its way toward Judah. Micah trusted that according to Yahweh's promise made long ago, some 250 years before his time, Yahweh would raise up a king from the Davidic line to yet rule over Israel. Even if centuries passed, Yahweh would make good on his promise. This is what Micah believed. Micah's from before, from days long ago, may also relate to God's promise of blessing to Israel through Abraham, some 1,000 years before Micah lived. Imagine that. Imagine being an Israelite and believing that God could make good on something he promised 1,000 years ago. That's an amazing belief. But Micah's mention of Bethlehem shows that his focus is on the divinely ordained monarchy of David, who was of the tribe of Judah and from the town of Bethlehem. Israel's hope was in Yahweh through the Yahweh-promised ruler shepherd descended from David. 2 Chronicles 7:18 provides confirmation that Micah had in mind the promise of God to David. Using the same language Micah used, God had reiterated to Solomon that the ruler in Israel, Moshel B'Yisrael, only 2 times. One of them is in Micah, Micah 5:2, the passage we're looking at. The other one is in 2 Chronicles 7:18, where God is saying to Solomon, I'm going to give you a ruler in Israel. Here it is. Then I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man to be ruler in Israel. Moshel B'Yisrael. That's what Micah is remembering, okay? The ruler in Israel is going to come because God promised it, and he's coming through the line of David. Now, the third phrase, the first phrase I didn't look at yet, his origins. Let's come back to that one for just a second. Because this phrase also, my former deity of Christ self would have said, oh, there's a hint of the eternality, pre-incarnate existence of Jesus there. But the word that's translated in different ways could be origin, origins, or goings forth. If you remember, the King James had his goings forth are from old, from eternity past. But the ESV had his origins are from old. So you can see the difference there. The translators are wrestling with the meaning and the understanding of the word. The form in Micah 5:2 occurs only here in the Bible, so now you really got a problem trying to figure out what it means, right? With the possible exception of one other place, which is a textual variant, in 2 Kings 10:27, and it means a latrine. What? How can the word, his origins, be related to a latrine? This is when Jehu made the temple of Baal in Samaria into a latrine, okay? This is the possible word that's there, okay? So what's the connection? Well, it's because this word comes from the word to go out. Okay, so I'll let you use your imagination why a latrine is connected to the word to go out, okay? The masculine form, our form is a feminine plural, but the masculine form, motzah, has various meanings, including a place or act of going forth, a word. Why would a word be something that goes out? It comes out from the mouth, okay? An exit, okay? If this was in Israel, that sign right there would be related to the same word. And that wouldn't say exit, it would say yitziyah, okay, where you go out. It can also mean a source, a spring of water. It can also mean east. Why would it mean east? Because that's the place the sun comes up from, okay? So all these meanings are related to the word, in three-letter Hebrew word, yatzah. Okay? Hebrew is built on 3 letters. This is a yod, tzadik, aleph. Everything that has that root in it means to go out, exit, okay? To go out, come out. So importantly, the word in the verbal form occurs in the verse that we're looking at, where it says, from you will come out the one who is to be ruler for me in Israel. Okay, so that word from you will come forth for me. That's the word. Will come forth out from Bethlehem, the clans of Judah, for Yahweh. We'll look at that in just a second. So one possibility is that this word motzah, motzaot, the origins or the goings out, refer to the ruler's appearances, right? When he comes out of his castle or something like that, his goings out, what he does. And this is why, like the King James took it as his goings forth. If you remember, he says his goings forth are from long ago. Or what he would do when he goes out. But more likely, and basically I agree with most of the translations, that the word has a connection to the origin of this one. This motzaot, it's a plural feminine, okay? As some English translations have, like the RSV, the NET, NIV, etc. His origin or origins, you'll also see it in the plural. I'll mention Dustin again. He's going to give a lesson on plurals, a certain majestic plural. Sometimes plurals in Hebrew don't work like they do in English. In many cases, with abstract ideas, you can get the essence of the meaning of a word by putting in a plural. Like I might use a plural word for youth, okay? Youth is plural in Hebrew, right? Why would it be plural? Well, it's the essence of what being young means, okay? So I think that's what's going on in this in this word. I would translate it as a singular. His origin. You could, not a big problem translating it as origins, but I think it relates to the physical ancestry. That's what Micah is thinking about. We have other words related to the same root that do relate to physical ancestry. Motzah, from the way you would say he's a descendant of David, you would use this 3-letter root meaning to go out. Okay, a descendant is related to this word. Okay, so I think this relates to the physical ancestry. From of old, his origin is from of old. The coming ruler's origin is connected to the nation of Israel's historical past. Further, if you have any idea of origin in this word, which many translations do, that implies that the coming ruler has a beginning, indeed, a derived beginning. So that's why the King James Version went with not origin, but goings forth. But it's tricky, right? Because some commentators want to go into the whole idea of an eternal begottenness of the Son and so forth. But it's speculation. This is just complete speculation. And it's just much better to see this passage as referring to God's promise to David. And Micah has trust in God's promise to David. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to speak a little bit about the context of this passage. Two different contexts. This will be a bit briefer, I think. The first context is literary, looking at some of the language around it. And the second context will be historical. And I think both of these help us understand that Micah is referring to historical past when he uses the phrase, his origins are from ancient times. First context, literary context. In Micah 5:2, it is Yahweh, the Lord, put it in all caps in English if you like, speaking via the prophet Micah. And Yahweh says that the ruler will come from Bethlehem of Judah for me. The ruler does not come forth from Yahweh. There's no eternal procession from Yahweh or something like that. He's coming from Bethlehem for Yahweh. The coming forth is from a geographical location. It comes from Bethlehem, and by implication, from the Davidic dynastic family. Also, the coming ruler comes from Bethlehem to rule for Yahweh. Right? If you've got Micah 5:2 open, you can see. He's coming to rule for Yahweh. That is, the coming ruler is distinguished from Yahweh. The coming ruler from Bethlehem is not Yahweh himself, but is Yahweh's designated, suggest human, vice-regent, who, like David, ruled for Yahweh. Also, 2 verses after the famous Bethlehem promise, Micah 5:4, just 2 verses down, Micah declares that the promised shepherd ruler will shepherd his flock in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh, his God. Like Moses and David, the coming shepherd ruler is not God, but has a God and is empowered by his God. You see how that literary context just pulls the rug out from any idea that this is God himself? He's ruling for God in the strength of his God. And then the historical context. It's when the Assyrian comes into our land. The historical context of this passage. Micah chapter 5, verse 5, just 3 verses down. This one will be our peace when the Assyrian comes into our land and treads in our palaces. That's Micah 5:5-6, right? See the context? Micah's words were spoken when the mighty nation of Assyria threatened to conquer both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel would be destroyed by Assyria, but Judah incredibly hung on. Okay, I'm going to give an unapologetic little advertisement for the Satellite Bible Atlas. If you're looking for an atlas, all right, these pictures were taken out of it. Here's a map depicting Micah's time. Micah lived in a town called Mareshah. It's about 15 to 20 miles as the crow flies to Jerusalem. But it's in the foothills. It's in the lower foothills to the west of Jerusalem. And when he was prophesying, he saw the Philistines trimming off areas of Judah, a coalition of the northern kingdom and Aramea attacking Judah, low foothills on the western side of Jerusalem, and then the hill country up above. So Micah's a little lower in elevation. He looks up, and you can get a sight line from Bethlehem from where he lived. Okay? So he sees all this territory being taken away, and he looks up into Bethlehem, I think, and he's remembering the promise of God to David, that a king would be ruler in Israel. So there's ancient ruins that are still there, and you can go and visit these places, right? In this case, this one's a little tougher to figure out exactly where Mareshah, his hometown, was, but we're pretty close. The two main candidates you can see circled in yellow here, they're very nearby each other. So the archaeologists will go in there, and maybe we get lucky enough to find an inscription or something like that. We have a couple of candidates for where this is. But Micah was a real person, and he had a hope that the descendant of David would come and rule. When the Assyrian was in our land, now you see what's going on in his time? This mighty nation of Assyria is coming in, and look at, they're trimming off the northern kingdom of Israel, the tribes like Dan and Naphtali and Zebulun. They're taking them away. They reduced the northern kingdom of Israel to a small area in the hill country. And then that disappeared. Okay? Micah saw that disappear. You see the difference between those two maps? Now there's only Judah barely hanging out. Barely hanging out. And Micah says, I got hope. From the promise long ago that a descendant of David will be ruler in Israel, he will be our peace when the Assyrian treads in our land. See how the context doesn't fit the idea of an eternal deity of Messiah? It's like, you think Micah was hoping in that? Was Micah a liar? That this person was he the ruler when the Assyrian came in their land? He's a liar if there wasn't some kind of a fulfillment in his time. There was a fulfillment in his time. The king's name, who descended from David, was, anybody know? Hezekiah. Okay, King Hezekiah shows up. He's the descendant of David. He trusts God. He trusts Yahweh. He was Yahweh's ruler when the Assyrian trampled in their land. And it was an amazing display of Yahweh's power. Because if you look at this map, by the time that Hezekiah is king in Judah, you see Assyria, which is where the Americans were getting involved, I think, mistakenly so, in Mosul, Iraq. Okay, this is about where Assyria is now, the capital of Assyria. And they were eventually made their way down to Egypt a little bit later. But you see, there's one little pocket right there in that whole empire that hung on for a brief while during Hezekiah's time. And I mean, this was an amazing display of Yahweh's power. Because do you remember the Assyrian army was poised to attack Jerusalem? And the Judeans went out the next one night, and the Assyrian soldiers were dead bodies. It's like Egypt. There's a parallel with what went on in Egypt. Israel came through the Red Sea, they see a bunch of dead bodies. The power of Yahweh. Yahweh was with us. God, Emmanuel, right? Emmanuel, God is with us. Not physically or something like this, but that was evidence that God was with them. And the same thing in Hezekiah's time. They went out, nothing but dead bodies. Indeed, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, Emmanuel, God is with us. Not ontologically walking around as a human being, but this is evidence that God is with them. So Hezekiah can be understood to be, and Jerry was talking about these kinds of things. Hezekiah can be understood to be a type, a parallel, or a paradigm of the great salvation that Yahweh has, I think to some degree, and will yet work through that greater descendant of Abraham and David, Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah. The events and deeds of the fathers are signs to the sons. This is a biblical phrase, kind of the things that Jerry was talking about. What happens to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, David? They're signs, they're parallels to what's going to happen to the sons. This is why the Jews were doing this parashah and finding these different connections. Okay? You have a sign, you have a paradigm. This is why Israel came out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I've called my son. By the way, Jerry, not to Palestine, but to Israel. He said, go back to Israel. There's no Palestine in the days of Jesus. Okay? A little bit of a historical anachronism to say Palestine in the time of Jesus. Okay. So now, how's our time? Because I want to just look for a second at Matthew's quote. Matthew's quote of this passage. Matthew 2, 5 and 6 quotes a portion of the passage from Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. It should first be noted that Matthew did not quote this passage from Micah as a fulfillment passage. He doesn't say that happened to fulfill. Okay? Rather, Matthew simply recorded the words of the Jewish scribes who believed that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem because of the Davidic promise. Remember, Herod the Great asked the Jewish scribes, where's the Messiah going to be born? They said, oh, Bethlehem, because it's written. Okay, this is what Matthew records. He doesn't say it was still fulfilled. He's only recording the words of the Jewish scribes. So, next, neither the Jewish scribes nor Matthew make any reference to the eternality of the Messiah. In fact, the passage quoted in Matthew does not even include the words analyzed that we just took all this time analyzing. Those words are not even in Matthew. These words that some Christians claim show the Messiah's eternality. Right? You know what I mean by that? Here's Matthew's passage. Okay, the scribes tell Herod in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it was written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. His origins are from ancient days. It's not even there. It's not even quoted. The scribes didn't include that part, or Matthew didn't record it. There's some interesting little differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, right, the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, and what Matthew recorded. I'm not going to go into it. There's nothing really significantly that plays into what we're talking about here now. But let's just note that there's nothing in the Matthew quote about the eternality of the Messiah. The words are not even quoted that some people think suggest the eternality. Matthew, like Luke, chapter 2, verse 4, associates the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem with the promise of God that the Messiah would be a descendant of David. The ruler comes from Bethlehem, not ontologically from God. The ruler comes from Bethlehem for God. Like David, the greater son of David is differentiated from God, but would rule and shepherd God's people over united Israel. This is one of the expectations when Messiah comes, Israel is regathered, like in the days of David and Solomon, right? This is a big hope and expectation of the prophets. Not just Judah anymore, but Judah and Israel, then all the tribes will be together. One final point, and this was a bigger point that I was able to speak on the last conference, and that is that finding the deity of Christ or Jesus in the Old Testament is not a New Testament exercise. Nobody ever does this in the New Testament. No apostle or Jesus, nobody ever goes into the Old Testament to find proofs or hints that Jesus is literally God. Such efforts are totally foreign to the New Testament. Finding proofs of Jesus' deity or his pre-incarnate eternal existence in the Old Testament, it's not a New Testament exercise. It's not an Old Testament exercise either. Nobody in the Old Testament says, oh, by the way, when the Messiah comes, he's going to be literally God. Finding hints or proofs of Jesus' deity in a passage like Micah 5:2 is an activity of men and women beginning in the centuries after the New Testament was written. Although it's beyond the scope of this presentation, we're already getting long. Early appeals to Micah 5:2 as evidence of Jesus' literal pre-incarnate or eternal existence could be tracked down. And I don't know if Finnegan's in here, but Dustin, these guys, right away they get on Bible Works and you can track down the church fathers, okay? This time I did a little bit of it. Church fathers, from what I could see, anybody pre-Nicene, before 325, like Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Origen, even Eusebius, he's right around that time, they refer to the passage, Micah 5:2, but in the main, only to describe that the Christ was to be born in Bethlehem, right? They're making the arguments that, hey, we know that Christ is going to be born in Bethlehem, right? And Jesus was born in Bethlehem, so for them that's an evidence. But they don't discuss the eternal deity aspect like Christians do today. So I was unable to trace anybody before Nicene that referred to this passage saying, oh, see, Here's the eternal deity of Jesus. I'm suspicious that they didn't do that because the LXX, the Greek translation, it looks, even with my limited knowledge of Greek, it uses this word eon, right? And days of a time period. So it doesn't, in the Greek translation, it doesn't lend itself to this idea of eternity, like you might get out of the Hebrew. So I think those Greek fathers probably, this didn't strike them as something declaring the eternal deity of Messiah. My guess is, at this point, and if somebody finds out, it's probably more when it got translated into Latin that this speculation started. To summarize, the eternal pre-incarnate existence, the deity of Christ's claims of Micah 5:2 are based on presupposition that force a wrong understanding of the Hebrew words into the passage. The words and phrases, bikedem, we looked at these phrases in Hebrew, miyeme olam, motzaotav, do not convey eternal pre-incarnate existence, but refer to events in Israel's historical past. The word olam, an age, perpetual or everlasting in some cases, is modified. It's restricted by the words days of. And you can look throughout the Old Testament at that phrase, the days of the age, it never means eternity. It always means human historical past. So when you have that days of in front of this somewhat ambiguous word olam, eternity, it's not eternity. It's restricted to time historical past. They refer to events in Israel's past. Next, the eternality interpretation ignores the literary and historical context of the passage, which speaks of a descendant of David from Bethlehem who was to rule for Israel by the strength of Yahweh, his God, when the Assyrians came into the land. The eternality interpretation misses the meaning of the passage. Micah expressed trust in God's promise of peace and salvation through a king who would descend from David, and I believe there was a remarkable, observable fulfillment of that promise, that victorious promise of peace in the descendant of David, Hezekiah, who ruled when Judah was invaded by Assyria. The faith of Hezekiah and the divine intervention in Hezekiah's days gives confidence that Yahweh our God fulfills his promises to Israel through the Davidic king. Now, this isn't necessarily in the Micah passage, but I would suggest that the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to David is in Jesus. In a similar yet greater fashion, even greater than in the days of Hezekiah, Jesus, the descendant of David, born in Bethlehem, is appointed by God to shepherd and rule God's people for God in the strength of Yahweh, his God, and in the majesty of the name of Yahweh, his God. God has made Jesus both Christ and Lord. Acts 2:36. The Gospel of Matthew mentions nothing about the pre-existence of Jesus in quoting Micah's passage. The words from Micah that some Christians claim show eternal deity of Messiah are not quoted at all in the Matthew passage. And then finally, neither Jesus nor any New Testament author ever appealed to the Old Testament to reveal the pre-incarnate eternal existence of the Messiah. Do you know what Jesus and the apostles did go to the Old Testament to show? That the Messiah would suffer and die, be raised from the dead by God, and exalted to God's right hand. That's what they continually appeal to the Old Testament to find. Amen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Bill. And I want to congratulate you because you have accomplished every scholar's dream. Your presentation has gone off without a hitch, and you have no difficult questions.
Oh.
You only have one question.
Oh.
Not too difficult. Are there any modern commentaries on either Micah or Matthew that are still arguing for the eternality reading?
That's a good question. I can't answer because when you say any modern commentaries, my guess would be yes. Out of all the commentaries out there, I would imagine yes that there are, because you still see this on the street, you might say. Sometimes the academic scholarship doesn't filter down to the average pastor or person on the street. And yes, you're going to have a more academic person saying, this doesn't really point to the eternality. Like even the NET note on this, the New English translation note on this passage, says what I'm saying, that the phrases in Micah 5:2 do not refer to the eternality, but it refers to Israel's historical past. So you can see some scholarship recognizes it, but then you can find other commentaries that will still say this is a eternal deity. I think I actually have one of them down here. So the answer would be yes, there are still some that are arguing for eternal deity in Micah 5:2, but you're going to see it all over on the internet and other places, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Let's give
Thank
one
you.
more round of applause for Bill Schlegel.